Okay, so now looking up at St John's Church. It was designed by George Edmund Street and built between 1861 and 1873. And at the bottom of town here, going to have a walk around the harbour side. So now on Torquay Harbour, looking over at what would have been the old 400 Club, the 5-storey building, and it was the older 400 Club during the 70s and 80s, playing a lot of disco music and 70s 80s music. Before that was known as the 400 Ballroom for about 50 years, and the inner harbour was built during the early Victorian period. So the 400 Ballroom on Torquay Harbourside was traditionally known as the place where generation after generation of couples met their husband or wife to be. The enormous nightclub was the 400 Ballroom for about 50 years, where it evolved throughout the decades. So on Kerry Parade now, just by Torquay Arcades, and to the right there used to be two of Torquay's oldest streets, Swan Street and George Street, which leaded off to the right here towards where Fleetwalk Shopping Centre now exists. They were knocked down. These two streets were knocked down in the late 80s to build a Fleetwalk, and Swan Street was, along with George Street, was one of the oldest streets in Torquay. And Swan Street, reading it, was cobbled underneath the tarmac and part of the old town. So there was a lot of Victorian warehouses, and might have been a slum during the 19th century. There was also a cafe on Kerry Parade called Addison's Cafe, and this was demolished for arcades. The Torquay Old Town, Swan Street and George Street, was destroyed in 1987 for Fleetwalk, and George Street was eliminated completely, along with 80% of Swan Street. So the surviving top section of Swan Street is accessible from Fleet Street. So looking here at St Luke's Schoolhouse in Melville Street, little Victorian building, built in 1861 and used as a school up until 1919. Melville Street here is quite an old area of Torquay and dates from around the mid 1840s. So I had a walk down here just behind Fleet Walk to try and capture some of the Victorian buildings and what's left of the Victorian streets, the Victorian streets of Torquay. This is the only remaining section of Swan Street, the very top end of it, which was one of Torquay's oldest streets, along with George Street. So apparently these two old streets, Swan Street and George Street, and the old town dated back to when the River Fleet, when Fleet Street was the River Fleet. The whole area of the old town of Torquay, Swan Street and George Street, was demolished in the late 80s and consisted of a lot of quite a few pubs down here, including the Printer's Elbow. There was a big tall Victorian warehouses on either side, and it could have been might have been quite dark to walk down and quite gloomy. I believe in the Victorian era there was a cholera outbreak in a lot of the slum areas of Torquay, and this would have been one of those areas where there was a cholera outbreak. So yeah, this whole area changed dramatically in the 1980s with the development of Fleet Walk, and subsequently the old town was destroyed and demolished, but there is some still remaining at this top end, where you can come at the back here and see some of the Victorian windows and Victorian buildings.